Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our partner session today. I'm super excited about this one. Today we have Irizarry talking about discussing design, improving team communication and collaboration through critique. I'm Simon Heaton, a content strategist here at Shopify, and I'm super thrilled to have this presentation going on today. For those of you who might have to cut out halfway through the presentation or your connection drops or anything like that, we'll be recording the webinar and providing everybody with a copy a week or two afterwards. Now on to our host. I'm proud to introduce Irizarry. He's the Director of UX at the NASDAQ Stock Market. Aaron is also a prolific speaker and author, having written, or co-authored, I should say, the book Discussing Design. Now, with that being said, I think we should just dive right into it, and I'll hand over the reins to Aaron himself.
A lot of times as designers, we will look at the teams we're working with and say, oh, well, that's just something that marketing says, or oh, development messed that up, or we hear those phrases like make it pop, make it clean, make it look like Apple, and a lot of these things actually, we kind of put the blame on the parties we work with as opposed to, kind of taking that responsibility for the conversation, right? And so what we see is that there's a lot of these things on the screen, and we can, you can see my screen still, hopefully, right? Because the GoToWebinar control panel isn't showing me all the questions very well. Actually, let me see if I can. This is rather frustrating. So we see all these different things, right? That won't work. What if we do it this way? This is terrible. What the hell? None of this is what I asked for. And this is all feedback many of us probably have heard, at some point in time. And I think that it's interesting, though, that if I take some of these away, and the only ones that are remaining are the ones from designers, then we look at maybe we are also on this end of trying to have better discussions around the work that we're building, right? We're just as guilty as marketing. I know I am. I've done it in the past. Just as guilty as marketing or development or product or whomever we say, gives us this unhelpful type of feedback. So, when we look at feedback, we've got to really try to understand its role in our process and in how we communicate with one another in our design teams, in our organizations, and with our clients, right? And so what happens is a lot of times we think of the words feedback and critique, and they're kind of interchangeable. Someone will respond, give you some feedback, and you ask a question, or maybe you respond to it and in a negative way, and they say, well, I was just giving you feedback, right? And I think that did it move away again? Gosh darn it. Oh, it seems to be working. Okay. Okay. I really apologize. This is crazy. So when we look at these different types of feedback, right, you think that, whether it's in the conversation of a formal critique or a different type of setting, we're having to give and receive feedback at some point in time in our process. And so what I think that we have is a few types of critique or feedback that I've learned to identify. There's reactionary, right, where someone looks at something for the first time and then they just have a response, like a gut response to it. Another one is direction, where it's more around do this instead of that, right? And then I think what we really need to do is take these different types of feedback as we think through them and kind of apply them more in a mindset of critical thinking, of analysis, of how we're trying to figure out why a decision was made and how we're going to get this thing that we're working on to the place we want it to get, right? And so when we get to that place of critical thinking is where we really start to come into critique. And an example of this, I would say, would be something along the lines of this, where we're asking a question. If your objective is to do this, or to have this impact, or to see this thing with priority on the screen. I'm not seeing that happen, so you may want to consider another route, or it's getting lost. Where this way we're talking through what the person was trying to accomplish, and maybe providing feedback that's more in line with giving them a sense of where it may not be meeting that mark, where it may not be hitting what they should, what they were trying to do, and that becomes a lot more helpful. Direction can be great because it can fix something. But that being said, there's no critical thinking in that process, and obviously there's not much critical thinking in a reactionary form of feedback either, because what happens is we just spurt out the very first thing we think of when we see something, right? And so the way to get through this, and the way to start slowly improving the conversations we have with our teams, is really to set up a kind of a tools and a plan, a framework that we can use when engaging in feedback sessions or critique that will be really helpful to us. And so what I've set for my team, and what I really try to remind myself is, first, what was the creator trying to achieve, right? And then how did they try to achieve it? And then how effective were their choices? And why or why not, right? Was what they did effective? And so by taking these 4 questions, I can now start to look at something that someone's been working on. I want to give them feedback. I want it to be productive. I want it to be helpful. So I say, okay, what are they trying to achieve? How did they try to get there? How effective was that effort and those design decisions they made? And why or why not? And I can even ask them, like, okay, so what was your goal with this design? What were you trying to do? Okay, and then how did you come to that process? How effective was that? Here's where I think you might be missing a little bit, and kind of walk them through that process and talk with them. And then it becomes, what's really cool about that is where feedback is often just a statement. Critique becomes a dialogue. It becomes a conversation that's active. It's living. It's something you should be doing and can do throughout the life cycle of the products you're working on. And so using this framework is a great way. These 4 questions is a great way to start getting your team to communicate more collaboratively, more productively, and make that effort to really use critical thinking to analyze if the designs you're working on are going the way they need to go. So really, there are two sides to critique, right? I'm sure most of us at some point in time have experienced that. There's giving and receiving. And what I think is key to remember is that the foundation of these is intent. If the foundation of critique is intent, it lives or dies by intent, right? The why. Why are we asking for critique? Why are we giving critique or feedback, right? So giving critique with the wrong intent is self-focused, right? This is something that I'm doing at the expense of the product or my team, but for myself, right? It's focused in more of me maybe trying to accomplish something or an agenda that I've come to this meeting with. And sometimes it's going to be natural for us to do that, because even just as people, we want people to see that we know what we're talking about. We want that acceptance and that validation of our design thinking or our ideas. And so sometimes we'll go into these critique meetings asking simply so that we get the pat on the back, or that we get, or we step up and provide some critique. It's maybe not helpful, it's maybe reactionary, or it's direction, and we think that we're showing what we know by doing that. And while I understand how that can happen, that really can be something that places hurdles in the critique process. As we continue to work through having these conversations, we want to do things that clear hurdles, that open up communication and collaboration. And coming into critique with the wrong intent, with some being more self-focused with my own motives, that could really put hurdles and roadblocks in the way. And giving the critique with the right intent is objective focus, right? This is, we're trying to get somewhere as a team. We're going to work on this design together, and we're going to get it to where it needs to go so our team can be successful for our clients or for our company, right? And so this is knowing that we're trying to kind of not put the focus on ourselves, nor on the person who made the design, but the design itself, and making sure that it's rooted in critical thinking, a fair chance to really come in and help us understand if we're being successful in our design efforts or not. So here's some things to keep in mind when we give critique, right? Use a filter. Gather your thoughts and reactions. We're going to have them. That's okay. And then just revisit them in the right context. Once you've learned a little bit more, when you know a little bit more about what was going on or why certain decisions were made or any constraints that someone may have been facing, that can become, you can start to revisit that initial thought that you had and see if it still makes sense to share, or if it's still productive, or if you were off base. Don't assume. A lot of times I think, we look at what someone did, and I think this is, I often see this a lot on Twitter, right? Where maybe Apple or some company releases a new product, and everybody starts kind of chiming in about what's wrong with it, or why it's going to work, or why it's going to fail, and all these different things. And none of them were in those business meetings, in that boardroom, facing some of the challenges and decisions that those teams had as they released this. So a lot of times we need to find out the design team or the designer could really be facing some challenging things with legacy systems or budgetary constraints or certain things that impact the decisions they made and why they made certain choices. So it's really important to figure out what those variables are. Don't invite yourself. No one loves to get critique like in a drive-by setting, right? You don't just roll up to somebody at the desk and start giving them feedback on their work. This is something where you just ask, like, hey, I saw you were working on that, or I saw your presentation earlier, or I saw that you shared that you were working on this or that this launched. I had some thoughts on it. If you were open to that, I'd love to share them with you. Instantly, that kind of does a lot in the area of diffusing defensiveness, and it shows an interest in what was going on and that you respect that person's time. And even if they're not ready, you're okay with that. You don't have to share it with them. And lead with questions. Show interest. This not only helps you understand more what's going on, what were they trying to achieve, how did they try to achieve it, those 4 questions we talked about. This also helps in the idea of showing interest in someone's process, makes them more open to communicate freely about what you're working on. They don't feel a need to be defensive. They're not feeling kind of attacked or targeted when you're giving them feedback or analyzing their work and telling them what may not be working. And talk about strengths. I think this is one of the big things I see that often goes missing during critique, is we're always talking about what needs to be fixed. But a lot of times we don't take the time to identify what is working. And I think identifying what is working is really important, because one, then okay, we're going on the right path here. And you don't want someone to not know that and go back and make revisions and end up change something that was working because you didn't identify that it was working. You only focused on the things that weren't. And in that process, maybe you lose something that was working really well. Also, I think as you do this, you want to, you talk about strengths. You identify things that could be helpful down the road, like maybe a pattern that you can reuse to bring consistency, or to build a pattern library with, or to add to your pattern library that will help your team build consistency in the design. Things like that I think are really important to identify. So it's important that we don't just focus on what's not working, but that we also talk about strengths when it comes to critique. Now, receiving critique is a little different. It's a little harder than giving critique, I would say, because it's you, it's your work, it's what you're passionate about, it's your stuff poured out on the table for everybody to analyze. And it really takes a level of humility and restraint, because there's going to be times when people who you feel aren't qualified to speak to the design work being done are going to give you feedback on what they think is working or not working. And so that can take a bit of restraint, knowing that they don't have the experience you think they do, or that you think you have. And again, this is one of those things where it's rooted in humility, right? Like we need, and I need to work on thinking through this idea of, okay, this is about the product, not me, right? This is about what we're trying to do. This isn't about me. This isn't about me versus them. This is about us making sure our product is going to be successful. So some things to keep in mind when we're receiving critique, right, is remember the purpose. Critique is about understanding and improvement, not judgment. So, if someone's telling you they don't think something's working in your design, you're still probably a good person. Like, this doesn't mean just because we're analyzing and making decisions about what's working in a design that the person is also being judged. No, we're trying to understand better how we can improve our products and our designs and get them where they need to go. Think before responding, right? And this isn't just so you don't blurt out something rude back to somebody, but this is also because you want to understand what the critics are saying. A lot of times, there's a lot of terminology within our industry that a lot of people say or use, but they all have different understandings of it. And so you want to make sure that you understand what that person giving you the feedback is saying, where they feel like something is working or not working. Participate. I think this is really helpful too, because a lot of times people are going to be maybe a little tentative to give us feedback because they don't want us, they don't want to hurt our feelings, or they know we've worked on something and they don't want us to feel like they're shooting it down. What I found is that when I present my work, I will point out areas that I'm really looking for feedback on, or I feel aren't working as well, that I might be stuck on, and that lets everybody know, like, hey, I'm here critiquing this work with you. I'm looking for feedback that I think will be helpful, and so that's like an invitation for them to participate and to be a part of the conversation, and it helps them feel more comfortable doing so. And then set the foundation, right? One of the things I think is really helpful with critique is to use what your goals are for the product, your objectives, any of your personas, or any of the information you use in research to shape and inform your design. Use that information to also kind of guide your conversation and your critique and how those things work. And I think really, I'm sure there's others, but the main three areas I've seen critiques in and feedback sessions are standalone critiques, which are super helpful, design reviews, and collaborative activities. Within the design process, I think these three are probably the three core areas that critique happens on a more regular basis. So before we start moving ahead more into facilitation, a few things to keep in mind. Critique is a skill. You got to practice. You're not going to start trying to change how your team talks about design or have a more productive critique and feedback sessions and be super successful right away. Sometimes it just takes doing it over and over again, learning what works with your team, learning how they communicate, and finding those ways to have productive conversations. Start small, too. If you just want to grab one other designer, one other person, and just start talking through your designs. I used to do this with one of my design directors, and at the end of the day, we would talk through our work together and get used to that dialogue of explaining our design decisions, talking each other through it. And then before that, before too long, we started getting really comfortable. We'd invite a product person to be a part of our conversation, then a developer. And we just grew this natural ability to talk about our designs in a productive way across different disciplines and teams. And it was really, really helpful for us. Think before you speak. Is what you're going to say or about to say going to help the conversation be productive, right? If not, then just write a note, revisit it later. We don't want to put hurdles in the communication process. We want to have more productive communication. We really want to get information that helps us figure out how to improve upon our designs. And choose your critique with carefully. Now, this may not always be possible. Some people are just going to be in the meetings. But if you notice someone's in the meeting and they're not into it, or they maybe really dominate the conversation or can become a little difficult, then see if you don't have to invite them next time. If something that can be avoided, that's great. Think of people who you think will be good contributors to the conversation, and just try to, as much as possible, use that kind of analysis of your team to get people in who really are going to be productive and going to be into having these conversations about design and shaping where the design's going. So what I've done for my team, and I suggest teams do a lot as well, is to establish rules, right? And so these are a few rules that I've established that I think are really helpful. And what I tend to do is I post them in the room, right? Or put them in an email to the team when we're going to set up a critique. And so, one is avoid problem solving, right? And I think this is kind of a real tough one, because it's our natural inclination when we see something to be like, oh, cool, we could do this, or oh, if you just move that right there, we could do this. Your mind goes into that kind of from analysis into solving mindset, right? And so when you do that, though, you do move away from analysis. And the purpose of a critique session is you'll probably have certain things you want to cover, things that you want to make sure you get feedback on. So if you switch gears to problem solving, then you may not get through all the points that you wanted to get feedback on. Also, problem solving is just a different mindset altogether, and so it really kind of just hampers the critique process. So what I tend to do is, if it looks like we're getting into problem solving, because like I said, sometimes it's your natural inclination, like how to fix that, or you have a great idea for it, then the best thing to do sometimes is just stop the critique, reschedule for a little bit later, and then spend the rest of your time solving that problem. It may be a really gnarly problem that everyone's been trying to work through, so that is a really good time to dive in and do it. But just don't allow the critique to be constantly derailed by that problem solving. These next couple, everyone is equal, everyone should critique. I think are really important. Obviously, establish a safe place to talk about your designs. Everyone who comes into the meeting should know that their input is valued and it's of equal value of anyone else's in that room. And they should know that for each other and for themselves, right? And it's really important that we get everyone to participate as well, because a lot of times people may be intimidated by subject matter, or they're naturally just quiet and they don't want to speak up, but you could be missing some really good insights. And I've even had on the opposite side of that, someone sitting in a critique session, they don't say anything the whole time. And then not too long after the session, we get we get an email coming out to the managers, to me, to the design team, and the sky is falling. They're talking about how the designs aren't going to work and all this stuff, and it's causing a big deal. Yet they didn't say anything when we were in the critique just a while ago, or even like a few days ago, whatever the distance and time was. And so it's really important to make sure to avoid that as well by trying to get everyone to participate. And then the designer is responsible for next steps. This one also is hard because this isn't so much veto power for the design team or the designer. This is more of the setting up an opportunity for the design team and the designer to take what they've got from the feedback, go back and look at it, think it through, see what can be changed, analyze it against goals, and really kind of like dig into it a bit, right? So that's why it's important that we establish that the designer or design team is responsible for next steps, because this gives them that opportunity to kind of process everything they've just heard. Another thing that I think is really important, you've got your rules, you've kind of got that process, those 4 questions we were asking, is setting the right foundation, right? Using things like goals and personas and scenarios or user stories, things that you can refer to during the sessions to measure feedback against. And if you can have those things as guiding principles in your session, you can take some feedback and say, well, how does that affect this user we're designing for? Things along those lines, right? So personas, these can be, people do them a lot of different ways. I try to keep mine pretty succinct, down to like a page or so, just the key things I need to know. And then, when we're designing, we gauge our feedback in light of the persona. And when I say, I mean, when someone says, well, I don't really like that it works this way or that way, I don't think that's going to work, say, okay, maybe rephrase that. How do you think that'll negatively impact this persona we're designing for and the workflow that we're hoping they get through? And then it helps us to understand that and start framing those conversations around the product and the person using it. And it becomes very helpful, and it helps us understand workflows and where a workflow could be improved upon or where a workflow is working really well. And the other thing is goals, right? This is what we want to happen. We want someone to come to our site to learn about our product and buy it, or this person needs to come into this admin and do some approvals and manage their team, or whatever that scenario is. We want to know what those goals are for the customer as well as the business, right? It's really great to attach business goals to designs, because then you can start to measure your impact for the companies and the clients that you work with and for, because you can see the business outcomes as a result of the design. And so establishing those is very important as well. Principles, right? This kind of could be, I think of these as like the character of the designer, the characteristics of the design. When I think of something like a financial services application, one of the principles that start to come to my mind are like trustworthy, secure, maybe healthcare. We think of someone filling out some insurance forms. Maybe they have a sick family member. They want to feel comforted. They don't want, it to feel overly invasive. They just kind of want to get through this hard time in their life. So there's these type of characteristics that we can have for our products, and we definitely want to use those to guide our conversations as well. Is this application, is the content for our application too lighthearted for something that we're designing for? Is it too technical? Is it too confusing? Things like that. Use these to guide those critique conversations. Scenarios. These are also just like user stories. These are what you want the customer or the user to accomplish when they're using your application or the site. These base workflows that they're going to go through. So as you think of those, they become your allies, right? The user goals, business goals, personas, scenarios, principles, all these things are really helpful. And if you keep those artifacts around you, then you're going to have them to measure that critique you're getting with pretty easily. And one thing I've done is actually made what is called like a mini brief, where I have just the key information from each one of those things on a sheet of paper that we can have with us at the meeting to talk through. Then we can refer back to that info really, really easily. And so now that we start to understand that, let's look at standalone critiques a little more. And here's why I'm a big, I just love doing standalone critiques, because formal critiques are fine, but standalone critiques I like because if I'm just kind of working on something, I feel comfortable and I need some feedback, I can grab my coworker and say, hey, can you give me 10 minutes a little bit? I can walk you through something and get some feedback. It's kind of impromptu, right? It doesn't have to be the scheduled formal review type process. It's just something I can do as needed, right? And you can make them a part of your process as well. Just know that like every Friday is going to be critique. There's going to be a critique session, and people can sign up to come show their work, or it's a part of your sprint process where you have that critique session in there. However you want to do that, it's really helpful. And so I think that's good to know that it's really important for us to remember that we can kind of step into this idea of improving how our teams talk about design a little easier. We can kind of ease in by just grabbing somebody here and there and talking through our designs, or setting up like a time everybody knows every week if they want, they can share and get feedback. Things like that I think are going to be helpful too. And that's why standalone critiques are really great for teams. As we think about it, the design process, we have that typical cyclical kind of design process where we observe and evaluate, synthesize what we saw and use that to inform our designs, and we make something and then we go around again and kind of do this process over and over again, right? What I like is critique, I often tell people, is like an internal research tool, right? So while in research you're doing some discovery research, and then as you start building, you start doing usability testing to validate your assumptions. Critique is also along there, that you have your ideas of what needs to be built and who you're designing for and the scenarios you're designing for. And as you go through that process, you can use critique over and over again as much as you need to help make sure that you're on the right track and you're getting the product where you need to go. So it's a really helpful internal kind of research tool, an evaluation tool, an analysis tool to help us improve the designs we're making for our customers, right, and for the companies we work for and with. And so I think it's really important to understand that it should have that prominent place in the design process. And to follow that, what's really cool is because critique is just about like iteration and improvement, anything you're looking to improve on, you can critique, right? So you don't just have to critique like some wireframes or some mock-ups. You can critique your personas. You can critique your project plan. You can critique your research findings or your research process. Like anything you want to improve, you can use critique as a way to do that. And so it's really cool, and I think it's cool to see when this starts to happen with teams, when critique starts to get out of that, just, oh, I'm giving you feedback on your design, here's a list of changes, go do that and fix the design. And it becomes this kind of like living, breathing kind of conversation that permeates everything you do as a team and with the conversations you have with the teams you work with and alongside of. So I think it's really important to understand that critique is so much bigger than just knowing whether the button should be this color or that, or whether there's enough padding on a screen, or whether the wireframes properly capture a flow. Those are all important and they're a part of it, but critique can be much larger than that if we allow it. So with this said, when you're getting started with critiques and you want to start inviting some people to the meetings, right, to some sessions, who do you invite? One of the things I've learned, and I kind of learned the hard way, was I used to only invite the design team. But what I really want, and I would always seem like to get the right feedback from them, but when I talk with other groups, whether it's developers or product managers or project managers or executives, there would always be something different, and they wouldn't understand something. And so what I realized is I really got to get all these people I work with involved in the conversation quicker, right? And so I started getting them involved in critiques sooner. I try to invite, whether it's the marketing team or the business managers or the developers, anyone I could, I invite them to come to the critique and to talk about the work that we're doing, because one, it helps us start to build a shared vocabulary about the things we're building, but then also they get that partial ownership in what we're building together, and it can increase communication with one another and collaboration. So a lot of times, I know I'm guilty of this, designers will not send their work out till the time of the critique, right? Which I totally understand why that's done, because I've done that in the past where I've sent it out a few days ahead of a critique and I got tons of email critique back. But what I really like to do to get critiques going is, as the first step of facilitation, is to send an email out saying, hey, on Wednesday, we're going to have a critique. We're going to look at these few items. Here's the goal of the critique, what we want to do, and here's the screens that we're going to review. And then I make sure to highlight or bold or asterisk, I'm not looking for feedback now, but I wanted to get these out a couple days in advance so you could gather your thoughts and questions and bring them to the meeting. And that helps everybody kind of be prepared and let them know kind of what they're getting into and come to the meeting ready to participate. And once we're in that meeting, I think facilitation is key. I think facilitation is really it doesn't get the focus it needs in the design community as a designer's tool, right? And I really believe that as designers, we always have to present our work. We have to have meetings about the work we're doing. We constantly have to have these conversations, and maybe we're doing some workshops or whatever it is. So facilitation is actually kind of a pretty big part of what we do. And so for facilitating critique, there's a few things I think are really helpful. One is having critique goals. Everybody comes in this way. Everybody comes into the meeting knowing that you're going to have a certain amount of time and certain things that you're trying to cover in that meeting. And so not only do you have goals for the product, but you have goals for the critique as well. We're going to look at these 4 screens. We're going to try to get feedback on these specific areas on those screens, and our meeting's going to be about 45 minutes to an hour, right? And so everybody knows what they're getting into, and it kind of helps set the tone for the meeting, right? Another thing that I think is really important is using active listening, and this is really just kind of repeating back what the person said. So if someone were to give me feedback and say, hey, I really don't think that that information that you put on the screen, if that's supposed to be the most prominent thing, it's getting lost amidst all the other things on the screen, you might want to figure out a way to make it have more priority on the page. Then, my response to them, if I'm active listening, should be, okay, to make sure I understand you right, this account information for the customer is you're saying it's getting lost amidst all the other elements on the page, and I should maybe move it up higher or change the color or the treatment so that it becomes more apparent. And then that gives the person giving feedback the opportunity to say, yes, that's exactly what I meant, or no, that's not what I meant. Actually, what I mean is this, right? And so that way you validate that you're getting the correct information, that you have the right understanding of the feedback that's being given. Another way to get a critique session going, especially if you have people who aren't used to them, is to use round robin and quotas. So round robin is just going around the room one by one and offering feedback. And then if you attach quotas to that, you tell every person, we're going to go around the room, starting on the left side and go all the way around to the right side, one by one, and I want everybody to identify 2 things that work and 1 thing that they're having that they either have a question about or they have a concern about. And then you've given them this, you kind of framed it for them. Okay, I know what I need to do now. So then it's easier for them to get their content and their feedback into you in a way that's helpful. Direct inquiry is if someone's being quiet, just call them. I'm like, hey, I haven't heard much from you. What are your thoughts on this? And this kind of goes back to that everyone critiquing thing that we talked about a bit earlier. And then 6 Thinking Hats. This is a book by Edward de Bono, which it's definitely a really interesting book. And the idea of it is this idea of like a lens or filter-based analysis, right? So there are 6 hats. Each one is a different color, and each color represents a different way or lens of looking at information for analysis. And so, one hat is emotional response, and one hat is things that you think are working really well. One hat is things you have immense concern about. And so really, you don't really have to wear hats unless you really want to. But it's the idea of a great way to get feedback is just to go through these different ways and different lenses of looking at what's being analyzed. And so it's definitely a pretty interesting technique and interesting book, and it's helped a lot of business come to hard decisions collectively and collaboratively as a group. And the last thing I would say about facilitating is using facilitators. When I first started trying to get one of the teams I worked with to critique as a group better, I tried to facilitate the meeting, I tried to take the notes, I tried to ask the questions, and it was just too much and it was overwhelming. And felt like though everyone was starting to participate, I wasn't able to do all the things I wanted to do effectively. And so I started partnering with someone to facilitate and having them do that so that I can present my work, document people's questions, document their feedback, ask questions back, and that person would worry about getting each person participating. And as I got better over time and more comfortable, I started doing it myself, because the one thing I would start to run into sometimes is that I would want to ask one more question, and the person on the, who was facilitating for me would move on to the next thing. And so it kind of just put a little bit of herky-jerkiness into the meeting. But I think they're totally fine to use. And then once if you get comfortable enough and you feel like you can run the facilitation part as well, then I say do it, because the more control you have over your meeting, the more you can really ensure that you're getting that feedback that you really need. That being said, even if you have the rules of critique, even if you have all the facilitation techniques, you're going to deal with difficult people, right? And this happens. People are difficult. I've been difficult. We all are difficult at some point in time. But at least we know that in one of these meetings, with structure, we can do a few things to kind of diffuse that. And so what I do with difficult people a lot of times is I use the things like the goals and the personas and that kind of stuff to help kind of reground the conversation. When they kind of, if they're being difficult, or, okay, well, what's that, what's that, you don't like this, you don't like that, okay, how does that affect this customer or this workflow? Or try to ground it in that the conversation there and see if that helps. Sometimes I'll go critique with them before a meeting and then see how that works. And a lot of times I've done that and they say, okay, cool, I'm busy anyways, I won't even be in the critique. And so then you've missed that. Or by critiquing with them ahead of time, if they do start to become difficult in the meeting, you can say, well, when we talked, you said these other things. Because one thing I've learned is people are often less difficult when they're just chatting and meeting one-on-one than they are when they're in a group setting. And maybe they're trying to prove something, or they have an agenda, or they feel uncomfortable, something along those lines. And another thing I found works is to use laddering, or what's called the 5 whys, right? And this is when someone's like, well, I don't like that. You're like, okay, well, that's not the most helpful feedback. So then you ask them why. And it's really not to ask them why as if they were like, if you're like a little toddler, why is the sky blue? Why? It's not so much that as much as it is asking, okay, well, why don't you like that interaction? Or why don't you think it works? And then drill down. And what I found is sometimes you'll just drill down far enough and like, actually, it's just my opinion, I don't like it. Or they'll figure out that they're not communicating it correctly, and through that process of asking questions, they'll figure out the right way to communicate what they wanted to. And so, they're not necessarily being difficult because they're trying to be a jerk. They may be being difficult simply because they're having a hard time communicating. With that being said, after the meeting, right, after the critique, remember, I've said multiple times in this session that it's this living process. It's something that continues. We don't want this stuff to die on the vine, so it's really important. So when you're done with the meeting, definitely thank everybody for taking the time. There's a lot of meetings that go on. So, this may be someone's like 4th or 5th meeting of the day. So make sure you thank them for their time, for their participation. Share what the next steps are. Here's what we're going to do, in the next meeting, and here's what we're going to cover in that meeting. The designer's going to come back and look at all this feedback you gave us, and we'll follow up individually for any other questions we may have. And then if there were like open questions or things that needed more research or looking into that came as a result in there, that's when you want to document these in here too and send that out to everybody so they all remember that that's something that needs to be solved. Design reviews. Now, a lot of us probably think critiques are design reviews, and I've often thought that myself, but what I realized is design reviews are usually right around the end of a product or a project and are not necessarily meant for critique, right? I think really they're very challenging because a lot of times there's a lot of people on a design review because it's used to like get sign off, right? Like this is the last okay, go or no go, are we going to launch? Are we going to ship this? And so what happens is you get a lot of people on the call. If the outcome is not really good, helpful critique, it's just like change these 4 things, then we can ship it. So that's all. I mean, these are all things that have to happen, but don't use design reviews as your critique. Try to take control if you can, which doesn't mean you hijack the meeting, but just start trying to remind everybody what we're trying to do. Come back with the questions and try to dig some information out that's helpful. Use a lot of things dealing with difficult people. Ask those questions. Why? Talk to the team before the design review. Or do we feel comfortable with where the design is? Recap the objectives. I know that we all think that this is we have to sign off on this and get it going out the door, but let's focus on this as really meeting goals and get that conversation back centered in a more critique-like conversation, and don't rely on them. Design reviews are going to happen. So what I suggest is that you, with your team, and with hopefully as many people as possible that are going to be on that design review, over time, critique with them leading up to the design review, and it'll make it a lot easier. collaborative activities, brainstorming, things like that, right? I'm not a huge fan of brainstorming because to me it always seems like it ends up in groupthink, right? They lack focus. One person writes something on a whiteboard, and everybody else, now whether they're for or against it, whatever they do is influenced by that one thing, right? And so it kind of, I don't feel like they're all that they're made out to be. I don't feel like they generate enough ideas. So what I like to do is design studio, right? And so we take two sides. We have divergent thinking. And so this is where everyone does individual exploration, right? Everyone starts to get their ideas down, whether it's sketches or writing things out. And then from there, we move into convergent thinking, where we have to narrow all these ideas we've generated down into a few that we think are the right direction. And one of the ways we get there is by using critique. And so in the design studio method, you will everybody does individual exploration. You got usually you're designing for the workflow you're going to try to design, all that stuff, and you sketch individually for a period of time. Then you critique with your team. Then you sketch one idea from the critique you received, right? And then you work with your team with all of your ideas after some more critique. And this allows you to not be influenced or not drug into groupthink. It allows you to be able to really focus on generating lots of ideas and then using critique to refine those ideas. And it becomes a really great way to communicate and collaborate with your team. And you can get everybody across all your different types of teams involved in this. And the thing I've seen over time with the companies I've done this workshop for or done this talk with or I've heard back from after they've read the book or whatever it is the ones who really nail down improving the conversation around design and critique with their teams are the ones that are really, really successful. With that, thank you for your time. I'm more than happy to ask any questions. And again, I apologize for all of the technical difficulties I had there in the beginning.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us today and talking about discussing design. I'm sure I'm not the only one who can say I've learned a lot just listening to you over the past hour. So as Aaron said, we'll be open to take any questions. Feel free to drop them in the panel, and I'll ask them on your behalf to Aaron. So we have one here. So Aaron, what would your recommendations be for someone who's more junior, trying to become more comfortable receiving feedback when they're presenting an idea to their team?
Yeah, that's tough, right? Because, geez, I remember when I first started, it would be nerve-wracking to present my work to people I knew who were a lot more experienced than me. Man, I used to get like sick to my stomach. So what I suggest is if you know that they're, they're going to have a presentation, try to work with them leading up to that, right? If you're the lead or maybe the design manager or just another designer on the team, see if you can set up time to just chat with them one-on-one, do that kind of standalone impromptu type critique, and get them used to talking through just their work and explaining it to you, kind of let them practice on you and give them insights and feedback afterward about how they presented, what they did, things like that, and hopefully that becomes helpful to them and kind of prepares them leading up to that critique. And another thing to do too is when you send the invite out for a critique session or you're talking to people, kind of really stress the way that you expect the critique to go. Let them know about the goals and the rules, and that it's not about judgment. It's about improvement and improving the product. And that's they see you kind of setting that standard. Probably going to make them feel a little more comfortable going in, knowing that everybody knows how the critique is supposed to go. But I think the most important thing that I've seen and that has been helpful on my teams and even with myself is just working with them leading up to the session. Give them that opportunity to practice and to give them feedback that they can use in preparation.
That's great advice. Another one that I actually have is, how do you suggest, what's the best way to react to feedback from like a C-suite or executive level that you might not necessarily agree with?
That's, if I had $1 for every time I got that question. Yeah, that's a tough one as well, because there are times when the executive can make the executive decision, right? They can say, well, I don't like that, and I'm the boss, and I pay you. There are those times when that happens, but there's also, you can also, if you set up kind of the rules and explain how the critique session is going to go and how you want that conversation to work during the session, then they know, like, okay, the team is going to take all the feedback they get back, they're going to revisit it, and they're going to think through it and unpack it, and then follow up one-on-one after. So what I do is, okay, thanks for that feedback, or I ask a few more questions to make sure I really understand what they're getting at, even if I think it's like, no, this is way out in left field. Then when we go back and we review it, after the meeting, I try to go approach them one-on-one, if possible, and say, hey, you gave us that feedback during the meeting. Here's what we did. We were looking at this, kind of unpacking all the feedback, looking at our goals, who we're designing for, and I really not sure that this fits there. Let's talk through this together. And I try to do it. So that one, I don't want to come across as challenging, and definitely don't want to do it in front of other people, because that looks like it's challenging their authority. And so I try to, by establishing that, we accept everybody's feedback. Not all of it's going to get implemented. And then I follow up one-on-one after we had a time to review, and I really put the case together for why I don't think that feedback is something we're going to use at this time. It's not just saying no to say no, but like, here's the actual reason why I think we're not going to go that direction, and it kind of shows that you've given thought to it, you've worked through it the best way you can, and that's where you're ending up.
I think that's great advice. So I'll just turn it to the attendees. If there's any other questions, feel free to drop them in the questions panel. Otherwise, I think we'll be wrapping up. So thank you very much, Aaron. That was a very excellent presentation. And for everyone attending, feel free to keep an eye on the Shopify Partners blog for a few upcoming announcements for future partner sessions. Our next one is going to be Refactoring CSS Without Losing Your Mind by Harry Roberts. Registration is now open for that one, so check it out on the Partners blog and register if it interests you. So thanks once again, Aaron.
Awesome. Thank you so much.